we are going through. And so we have a very distinguished panel here today to take us through uh, the topic. And those of you who have been watching CSIR during social media, we have been bringing to you various topics related to the impact of the coronavirus, be it the diagnostics or be it our research which is going on, what the precautions that have to be followed. So CSIR being a scientific organization, I think it's a rather interesting topic which we have never broached here in our webinars on the economic impact. But nonetheless, I think it's a very relevant topic because the pandemic has affected every aspect of life uh, in much beyond than what we comprehend. So we need experts to really decipher for us what are the impact and how do we deal with it. And also an interesting aspect is how science and technology can help, perhaps to mitigate the adverse effects. Is there a way? I think so. These are some of the interesting aspects which we would like to discuss today. So before I really go to the panelists, I would request our DG CSIR, Dr. Shekhar C. Mande, to give his opening remarks and welcome the distinguished panel.
Thank you, Geeta, very much. Geeta very rightly pointed out that with the onset of the pandemic about a year ago, it threw all of us out of gear. And some of you would have heard me talk in different fora is that CSIR, we decided to work on the corona pandemic ahead of WHO calling it a global pandemic. So our strategy, we had started thinking in the last week of February itself. WHO called it a global pandemic on 11th March. So we are about 15 days ahead of that. And about mid-March, we were able to roll out our strategy. And in about 1 year, we have been able to cover some ground, if not full ground, what we would have loved to. But nonetheless, we have been able to come up with new ways of diagnosis, faster ways of diagnosis. We have done some drug work, which drugs are already in the market now, and large number of Indian people who have been hospitalized because of COVID have been given these drugs, what our labs have actually made, especially favipiravir. Also, many hospitals use our ready-to-eat food, which is protein-rich, including AIMS Delhi and PGI Chandigarh. We have been routinely supplying them the food supplements, which actually help patients recover, hopefully recover better. We have been able to generate BiPAP ventilator, Swasthvayu ventilator, and large number of them have been sold in the market on today's date. Recently, Delhi government finished an order of about 1,200 ventilators, and we have been able to make the makeshift hospitals. So, for example, in a state like Himachal Pradesh, where the hospital space was running short, we were able to go and in flat 1 week, we were able to generate at 6 different places, 50-bedded hospitals with complete oxygen cylinders, ECG machines and beds and everything. So they're the kind of thing that we have been able to do, but yet, as I said, all the efforts that the scientists, not only CSIR, not only Indian science and technology community, but globally, it appears to be falling short of what the virus actually, the aggression of the virus. And one of the, of course, major side effects of the virus is it has not only disrupted all our normal life, but has had an enormous impact on day-to-day lives of even common people across the world. Some time ago, when we actually met on a different topic, is that when the DRDO had organized this Vaibhav Summit for engaging with the Indian diaspora about how Indian diaspora can be involved in helping us in bringing new views and things like that. CSIR actually created a Prabhas portal to engage with the diaspora. And one of the objectives of Prabhas portal was to engage continuously on dialogue of national interest and in general global interest with the diaspora. Now connecting the two, the COVID pandemic and engagement with the diaspora is what we are here today. Now economics is not our forte, CSIR's forte, but we are so pleased that we have very distinguished people on the panel today. In fact, Professor Kulkarni readily agreed to be on the panel, and I must thank him for this particular initiative that we should do. And so did Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal. And Mr. Bude, of course, has been very supportive of the Prabhas portal from beginning, and he has actually guided us in making the portal and trying to see how we can engage with the global community. So let me welcome all of you on behalf of CSIR for this, and we look forward to meaningful discussions on the economic impact of coronavirus. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mande, for putting it in the context and the Prabhas initiative and how it is important to connect with the diaspora. And I think in the last year's CSI Society meeting, Honorable PM himself had said that we need to involve the diaspora in all the addressing the challenges which is facing the country and the globe. And this is an initiative in that direction. And we are venturing beyond our expertise into economics. But I think Corona has shown that there is nothing which is not interrelated and multidisciplinary. Everything affects one another. And I think with those few words, now let's go to the main panel discussion. We have two speakers and one expert comments. So we have Professor Kulkarni, who is a distinguished professor of economics at the Metropolitan State University of Denver, Colorado. And he has been honored. He's with many outstanding teaching awards, and he has written many. And he was also honored with Pravasi Ratan Award by the NRI, showing that really he is contributing to the Indian ecosystem, although being in the US. So I think Professor Kulkarni has authored many books, and some of them have very famous textbook adaptations in the US universities, and he has many articles. And he serves as a chief editor of the International Review of Business and Economics. With those few words, thank you, Professor Kulkarni, again for being with us today. And over to you.
तुम्हाला अनम्यूट करावं लागेल. प्रोफेसर कुलकर्णी अनम्यूट करावं लागेल.
How is that? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you, Rama, and thank you, Geeta, and Dr. Mande and Dr. Murray for having me. It's about 10 p.m. in Denver, Colorado, which means it clearly my bedtime. And I think I'm going to talk about the coronavirus effects, especially on the U.S. economy. But if you feel that I'm talking in the sleep, then you are probably right, because this is my bedtime anyway. But don't worry too much. My wife tells me that I make a better sense when I talk in the sleep rather than when I'm talking awake. So hopefully that will happen same way today also. But thank you for having me here. I think it is a very important topic, and I have been invited to speak at many different places on the same topic. And every time we have a lecture in India, this problem of the timing always comes up. Because we are exactly 12 hours apart from each other. But I'm just very delighted to be here. So let's get started. I think let's talk about, and I think if you have not heard about coronavirus, then of course you don't live on this planet, because there is no human being on this planet who is not affected by what happened last March. And started with the Chinese Yuan city. The virus started spreading all over the world. It came to US in first and the second week of March, and it spread so bad and so fast that the government had to shut down in the third week of March almost everything, and the whole economy as such came to a standstill. Now, when everything closes and everything is under lockdown and nothing is working except very, very few emergency services, then of course the GDP, the gross domestic product of the economy, doesn't really get, of course it doesn't get produced. And if it is not produced, if nobody is employed, nobody is working, everything is closed, then if nobody produces, then nobody gets a job to do. And therefore, in less than a month, it was clear that people were losing jobs left and right. I know there was a lot of people who took vacation for 1 month and all. Some people started working from home. Computer helped what we are doing right now. Microsoft Teams helped. The Zoom helped. And some people started communicating with each other via computer. But the fact still remains that if no GDP is produced, then no employment is generated. And if no employment is generated, within a matter of 3 or 4 weeks, by April or so, the unemployment rate in the US reached to 25%. Now, having a 25% unemployment rate is probably a reminiscent of what happened in Great Depression in the US. And in Great Depression in year 1931, which was the real ebb of Great Depression, US did have 24 or 25% national unemployment rate too. And we reached to that 25% unemployment in month of April. But the difference between now and then was it took about 4 years to reach to that 25% unemployment in Great Depression era. In here, it happened in less than 3 or 4 weeks. And reaching to 25% in 4 weeks is clearly stopping the whole economy and then creating a chaos, probably creating a cliff from which the whole economy just completely collapsed. And things were extremely dangerously uncertain what was going to happen in the future. And when we have a crisis of that kind, which obviously nobody has ever seen before, we needed some kind of an emergency solution. And that emergency solution was offered by the fiscal policy of US as well as the monetary policy of US. And I think it is the policy response to this extraordinary crisis of 25% unemployment, almost 16% decline in GDP, and prices were kind of stable, but in general, the economy was in a very, very bad shape. And I think there are parallels to this happening in Europe. There is a parallel to this happening in India as well, when the lockdown started coming there too. But US economy numbers obviously are extremely high. And Chinese numbers, we probably don't even know, because China didn't really publicly tell us how much was the loss of GDP as well as how much was the unemployment and things like that. But in the US, where the information flow is so visible, and people can easily find out what is happening in each and every state. Well, like in my state of Colorado, the normal number of unemployment registered per week do not go more than about 5,000. So 4,500 or 5,000 is a normal number per week of unemployed folks in the state of Colorado, let's say in February of 2020 or March of 2020. In April of 2020, that, just to give an example, that 5,000 number reached to 54,000 people who filed for unemployment in Colorado. And about the same picture was done all over the country, and 25 million out of 170 million. And I know but nowadays the million number floats around so much in academic journals and all. But if just for your information, 1 million is 10 lakhs. So 10 lakhs is 1 million. And US has about 170 million labor force. 25 million Americans lost a job in just less than 1 month. And to respond to that kind of a job loss was government found that this is clearly a challenge, unprecedented, and therefore it got into action. And the way fiscal policy is activated in US is basically the Congress, which is many times called the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives, which has about 435 members, all these congressmen, they come up with bills to pass. And once the bill is passed in the Congress, it goes to Senate. And Senate has about 100 senators. And if Senate passes that bill, then it goes to the president to sign it. And once the president signs it, it becomes a spending bill. And in month of March, the process started. In month of April, it finished. And President Trump immediately signed $2.2 trillion worth expenditure bill. And in that expenditure bill, obviously, there was a lot of aid to those who were unemployed. There was a moratorium on the housing rent, that so nobody could evict anybody for not paying the rent. And there was an actual cash payment of about $1,500 for every person making less than $75,000. Which was about 80% of the labor force anyway. So they actually created a extra income as a free money. Well, there was a little political trick to that. President Trump insisted that when the checks are sent, there should be his signature on it. Yeah, so I think politicians try to play game with that too. So his signature was on that check, and everybody was given the check, cash money by the government to survive. So this survival money was in that $2.2 trillion. And I know these are American ways of expressing the measurements, but just as I told you, 10 lakhs is 1 million. And 1,000 million is a billion, and 1,000 million is a billion. So billion is 10,000 lakhs, and which obviously comes down because 100 lakhs is 1 crore. So 1 billion is 10,000 lakhs, or 1 billion is 100 crores for Indian measurements. And 1,000 billion is a trillion. So 100 crores times 1,000, and that is how many are the trillion, and therefore 2.2 trillion, which is 100 crores times 1,000 crores. That's how much 1 trillion is, and U.S. Congress passed a bill of spending that 2.2 trillion. Now, another way to say what 2.2 trillion is to give you a figure of what is the annual expenditure of the U.S. Congress or the U.S. fiscal policy is. Well, in 2019, when there was no major negative shock to the U.S. economy, and everything was, in a way, economically speaking, everything was smooth and cool, that time, the U.S. Government spent about $3.8 trillion, or $3,800 billion. And in just one bill, they authorized 2.2 trillion, which means, which is more than a half of the yearly budget was spent in just one big bill that Congress passed in March and April time period. So that will give you a rough idea of how expansionary the fiscal policy was adopted. Now, just about the time when this was seemed to be insufficient and the crisis continued, the New York state and California state, which were the hot spots of first surge as well as the second surge, in there, the hospitals were running short of ventilators, the beds. The Navy ship hospital with 2,000 beds was docked in New York Island. And clearly the situation was getting more and more grim. And as the situation was getting more and more grim, Congress passed another bill, which President Trump signed one more time, of $1.4 trillion. So 2.2 plus 1.4, that makes it 3.6. And you get the picture that the whole yearly expenditure was done in just two bills that Congress passed. And of course, the Senate agreed to it and the president signed it. And $3.6 trillion worth expenditure was done in 2020. Now, obviously, this expansionary fiscal policy was also helped by the monetary policy, the one that makes changes in money supply and interest rate. And especially the interest rate was brought down, and it was already down to 2%. But that 2% was made to come down to 1% and to 0.25%. So last whole year, Federal Reserve Board, or FOMC, Federal Open Market Committee, which makes these decisions about the interest rate, headed by Jerome Powell. He's the chairman of Federal Reserve Board, but Jerome Powell and his FOMC lowered the interest rate to 0.25%. Now, mind well, this is 0.25% is the interest rate that is charged by the Federal Reserve banks to the financial institution. So when the private banks want to borrow from Federal Reserve banks, that loan is called the discounts and advances, and the interest rate charged on that discounts and advances is called discount rate. And it is this discount rate which is made to be 0.25% by the Federal Reserve. And of course, there are some limitations that banks cannot just walk to Federal Reserve and get unlimited amount of discounts and advances. They need some special privileges. There are some constraints about that. And then it is not really freely available loan from Federal Reserve. But then this discount rate is an amazingly nice signal for the financial institutions to lower their interest rate, because when banks are told that in case of emergency, you can borrow from Federal Reserve at 0.25%, then banks themselves start lowering their interest rate for customers, as well as, and in the US, they have what is called a correspondence banking system. And in India, of course, we do have a correspondence banking system too, because we allow banks to talk to each other. We allow banks to have each other's accounts. Banks can borrow from each other. And when banks borrow from each other, in US, we call them federal funds. And there is an interest rate on those loans, so we call it federal funds rate. And besides that federal funds rate, of course, there is the prime rate. Prime rate is the interest rate that banks charge customers. And so clearly when Federal Reserve is lowering that discount rate to 0.25%, banks started lowering their loans to the customers. And no wonder then, starting in June, July, and August, in that time period, the mortgage interest rate, even if you want to borrow the loan on your house, you ready for this? And some of you probably know all this, but this will shock you staying in India, that the mortgage interest rate for us is 2.5% now. It's almost a free money. And I know, as an economist who it will be foolish not to borrow at a 2.5%. So I told all my relatives, my both daughters and myself, we just refinanced our house. We just borrowed more now, because who wants to give up this opportunity for borrowing at a 2.5% interest rate? And clearly there was a huge demand for loans. The housing market is picking up at a very, very high rate now. The houses are being sold left and right, and bought, sold left and right, because there are a lot of buyers for the houses. So the recovery is already there thanks to this lowering of interest rate. Besides lowering this interest rate, the currency printing is done. The open market operations are done such a way that the Federal Reserve banks will start buying the treasury securities in the bond market, and that's how the money supply is raised too. So there is an expansionary monetary policy, and there is an unprecedented expansionary fiscal policy. And coming back to our fiscal policy, which Congress spent $3.6 trillion in those two bills that we just talked about. Guess what is that going to do to the budget deficit of the government? And the budget deficit of the government, added to that the normal $3.8 trillion that government will spend anyhow. So 3.8, which is a normal yearly expenditure, about 4 trillion. Added to that, this 3.6 trillion. So we had roughly $7.5 trillion, $7.5 trillion worth expenditure by the US government in 2020. And this $7.5 trillion expenditure by the US government was supported by only $3 trillion tax revenue with the Treasury. Because clearly, as people are not having the jobs, they don't have any incomes, and the income tax is a main source of the US Treasury, and that source generally runs into $3 to $3.5 trillion. And the point I'm trying to drive to you now is that in 2020, US government ran roughly 3.6 or $3.7 trillion budget deficit. Now 3.6, this is all estimated. All the numbers are not in yet, but it is a good estimate to say that there is going to be about $3.5 trillion budget deficit for the US government. Now compare that to the earlier record of budget deficit. And without doubt, this budget deficit of the US government is a record-breaking budget deficit, hands down, because the earlier budget deficit, the highest, was no more than 1.5 or $1.7 trillion in 2011 in President Obama days. And in that time, he was going through the financial crisis. Similar ideas were happening there, that the government had to spend more, and it did, and it ran a $1.5 trillion deficit. So we now have a 3.5 or 3.6 trillion dollar deficit. The question is, where does the Treasury get the money to spend more than the tax revenue? And when you have that kind of a question, for US Treasury, the most favorite answer is to sell the bonds to the public. So what Treasury does is Treasury creates a bond and sells them to the public. Public buys the bond, and not just the US public. The bonds are sold in the bond market, which is clearly open for anybody and everybody in the world, and therefore there is a bond selling done in the bond market. And as the Treasury bonds are sold, there is a national debt created. And I know as there is a national debt created, there is a big push to this national debt to go up every time there is a budget deficit. Now, as the history shows, from 1969 until now, barring aside last 2 years of Clinton administration, year 99 and 2000, each and every year, US government has a budget deficit. And if the US government has had a budget deficit, every year Treasury had to sell bonds to the public. And as the bonds are sold to the public, the national debt is created. Well, year by year, that national debt has increased. It reached to several trillion dollars. In fact, it reached to $9 trillion when President Obama took office in 2008. And President Obama's reign was over in 2016. And in year 16, that national debt increased from 9 trillion to 18 trillion. And now from 2016 to 2020 and 2021, that national debt has reached to $25 trillion. And it is very soon, it is going to $26 and $27 trillion, but it is somewhere there at $26 trillion. Now you will say, well, that's okay, that if you can borrow, but if you prosper, then you should have this economic growth, even if the debt is there. And America is a big country, someday they will repay that debt. Not really, because as economists and financial experts will immediately point out to you, the main ratio that decides the health of the economy is what we call the debt GDP ratio. And the debt GDP ratio, when the national debt is increasing so fast, so quickly, that debt GDP ratio is already more than 100% for US. It was 36% in 1970s. It was 50% in 80s, and now it has gone beyond 100% because the debt is about 25, 26 trillion dollar. GDP is about 23 trillion dollars. So clearly that debt GDP ratio has gone. Well, when this debt GDP ratio goes out of control and out of your hand to 140% and 150%, you become a case like Italy and Japan has a very debt high. Well, good news for India is that India's debt GDP ratio is not very high, and therefore I don't think India has to worry too much about it. But there are a lot of other countries like Greece and Turkey and Ireland and as I said, Japan, Italy, all of them have a 150% and beyond debt to GDP ratio. And when that debt GDP ratio goes out of 100, that's when the bond ratings start becoming questionable. And if nobody buys your bond, then you have to raise the interest rate, and the financial crisis gets much worse when that ratio goes up there. And I think that is the major worry right now for most of the US economy thinkers. But if that worry is there, there is a good news that has popped up. And the good news is obviously on the vaccine front. 3-4 companies have come up with amazingly, well, we'll find out how amazingly it is a really successful vaccine. But people are all excited about taking the vaccine, and the vaccines are floating around left and right. As you may have heard, just yesterday they reached to 100 million vaccines given in US, in a country of 320 million. So that's 1/3 of US is now vaccinated. And if this vaccine really works considerably, and if the numbers come down, then the US economy will have a very quick turnaround and the recovery will begin. And in the third and fourth quarter of 2020, thanks to most of these expansionary policies, of course, the turnaround is there. The unemployment has gone down from 25% to, ready for this, 8% now, and is probably going to go to 6% very soon. So unemployment is going down, GDP is increasing, more and more businesses are going back to the new normal, if not the old normal. I think it will take time to go to the old normal, but the new normal is there. And I know Geeta and Rama have told me that I shouldn't be talking more than 30 minutes, and I think that's a very rational thing. So let me use my next 3-4 minutes to bring out the 3 important economic facts which are very clear in this crisis. Number 1 fact is that just like any other crisis, this crisis has helped rich people to get richer and poor people to get poorer. Well, it's not helped, but it has made poor people poorer and gotten rich people richer, which obviously means the inequality of income has increased in last year. And just to give you an example, all billionaires combined in US have increased their estate by 30%. So the value of their wealth has increased by 30%, all billionaires. That's just a sign of how the rich have gotten much richer. This crisis is no exception for that. The inequality of income has increased, poor have gotten poorer, and giving obviously a special attention to reducing this inequality in the future, of course, by having more taxes on the rich, is probably an imperative action that the government has to take in the future. So higher taxes is not just a possibility. In my opinion, it is going to be a certainty for next few years to reduce that inequality, as well as have a higher tax revenue. The second fact of all this is what has happened to the international trade. And the global trade volume has shrunk at least in the crisis days back in April and May, by about 18%. 1/5 of the global trade has vanished. And clearly, without having a higher global trade, and India is a great witness of that, that higher is the volume of international trade, better is your economic growth. And yeah, and India and China have really seen that from 1990 onwards. So I think reduction of the global trade by that volume is a pretty serious business, and it has taken its own time to come back because the transportation, the ships are not roaming as fast as they were. The planes are not flying, and clearly that is another worrisome thing that has happened in the crisis. And my third fact that I want to point out to you, that after crisis, countries have become less friendlier than less friendlier than before. Almost everybody is taking suspicions about each other. The travel is curtailed. The vaccines are required for your air travel. Most of the flights were cancelled. I know Mumbai airport was not working, neither was Delhi airport for a long time, and therefore the international travel has really affected, which obviously means that countries are getting more and more isolated, more and more suspicious of each other, and that is clearly another worrisome development that this crisis has done. Well, with all these worries, of course, will the future be brighter? I think it has to be brighter because clearly nothing can be worse than what we just went through, and therefore, if the vaccine continues to be successful, maybe we will see a wonderful future for all of us in India as well as in the US. And I think, as I said, in the US, the situation is getting better and better almost every week. In India, I know there is some setback, but as the vaccine becomes plentiful, you will overcome that surge as well. And I hope so, and I pray so. But with that, I will stop because I have taken my share of 30 minutes here. Again, thank you very much for having me here. If you have any questions, the best way to reach me is to go to my personal website, which is kulkarnibooks.com. One word, Kulkarni Books, plural. So kulkarnibooks.com has all my information and my email address and everything. So send me the questions. And if you have to talk to or communicate me, that is a wonderful thing. Thank you again, Geeta and Rama, for having me. And hello to all of attendees here, and Dr. Murray and Dr. Dande. And I, of course, look forward to hearing the Indian perspective on this.
Thank you, Professor Kulkarni, for the excellent perspective on the situation in the US. And you left us with a note of optimism that the vaccines will really help us to get into the new normal. And we look forward to that. And now to hear about the Indian perspective, we have with us Sri Sanjeev Sanyal, who is the Principal Economic Advisor to the Government of India. He also serves as a co-chair of the G20 Framework Group, and he's an internationally acclaimed economist and also an author. Today, we have many authors on a panel. We are really delighted to see the diversity of our panelists. And Shri Sanjeev Sanyal was also the young global leader by the World Economic Forum, and he is a visiting scholar at Oxford University. He has many other distinguished accomplishments to him, and he has best-selling books. And with this brief introduction, I request Shri Sanjeev Sanyal to give the Indian perspective.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to speak to all of you. As someone who was a part of the group of advisors and administrators that dealt with this economic crisis that we went through over the last year, I hope to give you a flavor of how decision making was done during obviously once in a century economic shock. It is also quite, will be hopefully quite instructive to future generations, because it will give you a flavor of how decisions are taken under these kinds of circumstances, because obviously, you know, as a natural experiment, we cannot recreate this. So it'll give you a flavor of what actually happens and what goes through the thinking process of a policymaker when taking decisions under such circumstances. So let's go back a year back. In fact, exactly a year back. What is the kind of information that we had informing our decision making at that time? Well, the information that we had basically was that something nasty had happened in China. We didn't know exactly what had happened. In fact, we still do not know exactly what has happened in China. But we knew that it had spread to northern Italy. It was killing a lot of people and was spreading to other places as well. So clearly, we had to respond to it in some way. So like many other governments in the world, what did we do? We asked the experts, the virus experts, epidemics experts, WHO, etc., to tell us what is the likely outcomes. Now, we got a whole bunch of forecasts out of them. So there were one groups of experts who told us, look, this is not much worse than a very bad flu. And then there were other groups of people who told us that, look, there are going to be hundreds of millions of people infected and millions of people will be dead by July. You'll remember all of this from TV discussions from that time. So this is recent enough that you will know all of this. Now, different governments around the world, and as I said, I am also working as the co-chair of the G20's framework working group. So I was a part of many of those other countries' discussions as well. Different governments took this information and dealt with it in different ways. So one common response was to take this range of outcomes and guess which of these forecasts is the most likely forecast and act based on that. Not an unreasonable approach, but this is what many countries did. And this is how you ended up with the Swedish model, for example, or then you'll remember the UK went for herd immunity, then changed its mind. Singapore did something, then changed its mind, and so on and so forth. Now, in India, we knew two things. First of all, that whatever path we took with 1.35 billion people, we had to stick with that path. We had no choice. Once you went down, whatever it is, you had to stick with it. The second thing we understood, and this is why we were different from other countries, is that we decided that none of the experts knew what was going on. And therefore, the best approach is to move forward looking at this is as a situation of radical uncertainty, rather than waste our time trying to guess which of these forecasts was going out to be right. Now, this led to a very different response from India. So what do you do? How do you take decisions when you have absolute uncertainty? So one approach which is common, and I would argue is the erroneous approach, is to go for some median approach which sort of takes into account various possible outcomes. We did not do this. What we did is, those of you from a finance background, particularly if you do derivatives, will know as the barbell strategy. Now, what is a barbell strategy? The barbell strategy is a combination of two opposite strategies. So in this particular context, the barbell strategy was, we hedged for the very worst outcome and then made our way forward using a step-by-step iterative Bayesian updating of information. So now I'll give you the idea of how you go about this in the health perspective, and then I will show you that in the economic perspective, we did exactly the same thing. So on the health front, what do? We imposed a total lockdown in the beginning. Now, we came under a lot of criticism at that time, you'll remember, and it's not, and of course, there's a huge cost to pay on the economic front from it. It's not like we were unaware of this, but why did we do it? We did it because when you have no information at all, you have to take seriously the possibility that it may turn out to be as bad as the most pessimistic forecasts are. So while you're waiting for better information, and while you're putting in place quarantine facilities, testing facilities, gathering more information, you have to opt for a situation where you are hedging for the worst outcome, right? This is like buying a put option. Okay, so this is basically what we were doing on one side. Now, as information improved, we began to unlock it, because during this period, we managed to get the information out, much better information about what this was like. For example, we figured out after about 6 weeks that COVID, while it was not quite a ordinary flu, it was also not perhaps as dangerous as the worst case scenario. It was certainly dangerous to certain demographics, the relatively old or people who have comorbidities, etc. Now, immediately it changes the dynamics. We suddenly understood that keeping track of oxygen levels is a very important thing. Now, I had personally never heard of an oximeter, but I bought one, and I'm sure all of you did as well. So immediately you can do a step-by-step, you can see a Bayesian-based updating of information, which allowed us to take certain actions and so forth. Until we kept going till about September, where we were much more confident, where we were able to open things out. And since then, we have opened things out largely. And now we have a much more targeted micro approach at dealing with it. So if there is a problem in Maharashtra, we lock down certain parts of Maharashtra. And of course, we also roll out the vaccines on the other side. So this is how we have gone. Now, notice there is no need in our approach to try and figure out how the world is going to pan out. This is an iterative process. It doesn't require us to have a grand mega plan. Okay. Now, look at the economic process was exactly the same thing. When we did the lockdown, obviously there is an economic price to play. It came as no surprise to any of us that when you shut down half the economy, that GDP growth is going to drop sharply. And none of us were looking forward to it. After all, I'm the guy who defended minus 24% GDP growth rate to the media. So clearly, I knew I was not going to have fun doing that. So when we did this, what were we attempting to do? So remember, at that time, there were a lot of experts, both internally, and of course, there were a lot of Nobel laureates and other experts from the West who told us, have this grand package to reinflate the economy as fast as possible. And we disagreed with that and completely ignored that, because you have to remember that it was we who were shutting down the system for health reasons. There was no point in reinflating the system immediately. This was not a demand problem. We had shut down the supply side. There's no point in pressing the accelerator when we have got our foot firmly on the brake. And I've written this explicitly out in the economic survey, which we recently published. But even at that time, in April, May, June of last year, I was on the media all the time explaining this. There is no point in pressing the accelerator when you've got your foot firmly on the brake. So maybe other countries have these great trillion-dollar packages. We ignored all of that advice. Instead, we did the following thing. The same iterative process of a sequence of medium-sized packages. So, of course, at that time, we were mocked for doing too many packages, but this was deliberate. We were iteratively responding to how things panned out, because we were clear that this was not a sprint, it was a marathon. Okay. Now, also notice how we changed the nature of those packages as we went through time. The initial packages were not meant to reinflate the economy. I told you, we didn't want to reinflate it. What we were doing is one side of the barbell, which is creating a safety net or a cushion for those who were going to be impacted by this shock of a shutdown. So if you remember what we did, we created the world's largest food program. 800 million people were given virtually free food up to November. What is that? That's not a reinflation of the economy. That's simply a safety net. We transferred small amounts of money, but useful money to the very poor through the Jan Dhan network. Again, people mocked us. What will this small amount of money do? It cannot reinflate consumption. That's not the purpose. The purpose is to provide cushioning to the very poor so that they have some cash with them. Make sure they have, some health insurance. They make sure they have cooking gas. That is basically what we were attempting to do. This is a cushioning or safety net exercise. Exactly the same thing was done with the business sector. We put in suspension the insolvency and bankruptcy code and pushed back all the financial deadlines. Why? Because we didn't want a cascade of defaults to suddenly come and hit us. So what did we do? We postponed the whole thing and provided a cushion. We created 100% guarantees of loans to the MSME sector. What are we doing? Again, we're pumping in liquidity. The RBI cut interest rates, pumped in liquidity. All of this is not aimed at reinflating the economy. Even we are not claiming. So many experts came and says, oh, this will not reinflate the economy. Excuse me, we are not trying to reinflate the economy. What we are trying to do is to provide a cushion during a major shock so that nobody physically dies and no business also dies out as a result of it, or at least minimize the impact. Now, by September, when things began to look much better, we began to open the system up. As people came back on, some of the demand came back from pent-up demand, because after all, this was never a demand problem. It was always a supply-side shutdown. So demand came back, and we also supported that from the government side by ramping up capital spending. So in the month of October, the capital spending went up, I think, some 49% year on year, 69% year on year, if I'm correct. And then it went up 249% in November, year on year. In December, it went up 149%, something, though I don't remember the exact numbers, but they were a massive increase in capital spending. So what's happening? People are coming back into the system, they are spending, and you are also spending capital expenditure, and that's creating cash flow through the system. So that cash flow begins circulating, and suddenly the economy began to feel better. And all of you saw, car sales, all these things, all the high frequency data began to look a lot better, PMIs, etc. Now, by the end of January, early February, when we presented the budget, we were feeling even more confident. So we put in place a budget where we said we are going to commit ourselves for the next couple of years to carrying out support to the economy on the demand side. But even here, when we were saying this, there were several ways in which we were different from what many other countries may have done. Now, I don't want to criticize other countries. Maybe it makes sense for their circumstance. But in our circumstance, we were very clear. One, we were going to spend this money on creating capital assets. Why did we this? So this is very different from, say, the US, which you just heard, sending out checks, dole of various kinds, stimulus checks. The idea there is to stimulate consumption. Here, our idea is to stimulate investment, first from the government side, and hopefully then buy in the private side. Why are we doing this? Because we believe that future generations will have to repay these debts. We are very conscious of the fact that we will have to repay these debts. So the future generations must be left with assets to match the debts that we are running up. So we were very clear that we were going to have a much more investment-driven approach to reinflating demand than what, say, the US is doing and many other countries are doing through trying to reinflate consumption. Second, many countries made the point that many experts made the point that we should actually ramp up taxes in order to finance this. And our view was that this makes no sense at all. Because, you see, the idea is to provide a fiscal stimulus to the system. If you're going to take money from one pocket into another pocket, then how is it the net reflation of the system will not be strong enough? So we did not do this. Secondly, we were very clear that the medium to longer term model ultimately is to get the animal spirits back in the private sector. Ultimately, we can spend whatever we want to do through, building infrastructure, but we want to reignite in the longer run the animal spirits of the private sector. If we begin to increase taxes, which we, by the way, had only recently, in the end of 2019, we had cut corporate taxes. If we're going to again increase it, then what was the point of the longer strategy? So we did not want to do that. What we did is we allowed the fiscal deficit to increase somewhat, and then allowed over a period of 3 years for this to go back to the original trajectory. As we have argued in the economic survey, this is actually fiscally prudent to do as well. Because you see, fiscal sustainability is ultimately the difference between the nominal GDP growth rate and the nominal interest rate. So as long as the gap between the two is kept wide enough, the fiscal deficit, the debt to GDP ratio, will not go spiraling upwards. So what we did, we thought that the conditions are right for betting on allowing higher nominal GDP growth rate to do a lot of the heavy lifting. Because as higher nominal GDP growth happens, the debt to GDP ratio is both benefits from the denominator growing up faster But also remember, nominal GDP growth rate is what also drives revenue growth, tax revenue growth to us. And with that, we will also be able to do many other things in the system because the system will be running. So many of the other kinds of expenditure that we need to do will also come off. So this is one part of the short-term thinking. The next thing in which we are quite different again from many other countries, their strategies, is the emphasis on supply-side measures that many other countries have not had. Almost every other country in the world has basically been a demand-managing strategy. Our strategy has been heavily oriented towards the supply side. And an enormous number of reforms have been announced through this period. Again, we came under a lot of criticism for having so much emphasis on supply side when other countries were much more oriented to basically focusing on demand side. In fact, many op-eds were written in Indian and international press. Why are these people doing supply side reforms in the middle of this great crisis? For this, you need to understand our thinking again. You have to understand that we are very clear that the post-COVID world is not a re-inflation of the pre-COVID world. This new environment is going to have its own supply chains, its own geopolitics, its own technologies, its own consumer behavior, all kinds of things. And all of these things, by the way, will interact in ways that are entirely unpredictable. Again, notice the enormous influence of uncertainty, complexity, randomness in our thinking process. So just so that many of you may have guessed by now, I am very much a complexity theory man. I am not a Newtonian. Don't believe in equilibriums. I do not believe in trend lines. I'm a complexity theory man. So those of you, since there's a science background, we will know, you can clearly tell how my thinking process is coming. It's heavily derived from complex adaptive systems and chaos theory derived frameworks. So therefore, I do not believe in predetermined outcomes. And therefore, I am all the time thinking about what is it that we can do to deal with random and unpredetermined paths. So supply side measures that we are now doing is all about dealing with them. So again, look at how you deal with it. Let's go back to the barbell strategy. The barbell strategy requires you, on one side, to invest in resilience, and the other side, invest in flexibility. That is basically the same thing we did. Hedge for the worst outcome and adapt your way forward. We are not wasting our time trying to predict exactly how things will work out. What we are investing is in resilience and flexibility. So look at the reforms we have done and you will see clearly that they all fit into this framework. First of all, we have invested in doing all kinds of factor market reforms. For decades, we debated labor reforms. We did those. Now, all the central government labor reform, the dozens of labor laws have been put into 4 clear codes. All the internal contradictions in these laws have been gotten rid of. And we have 4 clear codes of labor laws done. We also introduced farm laws. Now, there may be some debate about, in at least 1.5 states, there is some opposition to it. We will listen to them. We will try and smoothen out the edges. But we remain committed to doing farm reforms. All these reforms that we have introduced were debated for at least 30 years in India. And every economist worth their salt supported it for all these 30 years, including those who have suddenly begun to criticize them. These reforms are needed. And as I said, we will tinker them in the edges in order to make it more palatable. But these reforms need to be done. We need to provide greater flexibility to our farm sector in order to be able to deal with future shocks, whether it is consumer behavior change or the fact that our population is no longer growing so fast, therefore doesn't need so much food, or the fact that you will have climate change and that will change the kinds of crops you can grow in different parts of the country. All of these require us to have farm systems more flexible. Again, notice emphasis on flexibility. Similarly, same reasoning why we want to do privatization. We are not ideologically committed to either being pro-private sector or pro-public sector. Where a public sector enterprise needs to be created newly, we will do it. We have just doing development finance corporation, which we are just building up, right? A new one. So we are not against creating new public sector enterprises where necessary. But on the other hand, there is no sense of using a private, the public sector should be running airlines, hotels, and these kinds of things. And we are very clear that in non-strategic areas, we will privatize. We've stopped using the word disinvestment. We are unapologetic about this, and we want to use the word privatization, and we will go forward and privatize. I agree that in the last couple of years, we haven't done a great job of privatizing because circumstances were such, but we remain committed to it. And I hope we will be able to do a good job going forward. I think we will. Let me assure you, we are working very hard to make sure that we actually see proper privatization going. Again, notice the idea is on flexibility. So we will be, exact same thing is true when we've been, Professor Monday will know, I was very much an advocate of some of these measures, like, for example, liberalizing the cartography and geospatial sector and taking away the monopoly of the Survey of India. You can clearly see, again, the same idea of flexibility and liberalization and opening things up. We similarly removed some outdated telecom regulations on the OSP and BPO sector. Completely ridiculous that we must insist on having, EPA-BX machines in India in a world where the world is functioning on the cloud. It makes no sense. So you can clearly see we are deregulating and opening up sectors. At the same time, now here somebody will say, but what about Atmanirbhar Bharat? So let me explain. This is the other end of it. On one side, the flexibility, the other end is resilience as well. So what do we mean by Atmanirbhar Bharat? Be clear, Atmanirbhar Bharat is not an attempt to go back to pre-1991 import substitution. We have no interest in driving ambassador cars again. So what is Atmanirbhar Bharat about? Atmanirbhar Bharat is about resilience, about leveraging our own internal strengths so that we can compete in the rest of the world and be part of global supply chains. Therefore, this is not about hiding behind barriers like we used to do before 1991. And let me illustrate this point very clearly so that there is no confusion about what we mean by this. Take, for example, the pharmaceutical sector, all in the news these days. India has been a major pharmaceuticals hub for a long time. So this is not a new thing that I am telling you. We, particularly in generics, in vaccines, in all kinds of things related to the pharmaceutical sector. Now, one of the discoveries of this particular crisis, particularly in the early phase of this crisis, was that for all our global competitiveness in this sector, our pharmaceutical sector was actually dependent heavily on key inputs from single source suppliers, particularly in China. And when the pandemic hit us, suddenly many of these inputs suddenly switched off. Now, if we then today say that we want to provide incentives and support for making sure that at least some of these sources are either produced in India, or we provide some sort of an incentive to at least diversify some of these sources of key inputs, then this is not protectionism. This is investment in resilience for a globally competitive sector. This is what we are attempting to do. We are not trying to protect inefficient sectors. Similarly, the PLI scheme that we have introduced, we do not think every one of them will necessarily succeed, but enough of them will hopefully succeed that we will be able to create clusters in certain key industries which we think will be important in the future. Again, we do not know exactly which one of them will work and exactly how it will pan out, because obviously, as I pointed out, we allow for the enormous uncertainty of the future. But we recognize that you need to create certain clusters in certain industries so that at least those skills are here. If they don't even exist, how will they adapt? So the PLI scheme is taking a few bets into the future to create clusters and, very importantly, to insert ourselves into global supply chains. This is why this is not a going back into the pre-1991 import substitution. Far from it, we are encouraging foreign companies to come to India and compete with Indian companies. Come here, Let Indian companies be exposed to the best in the world. Our private sector is competitive and they will be able to compete, but you need to provide them a place where they can test their ideas against the best in the world. And let foreign companies come and invest here so that skills are created. Let our workers be exposed to the best technologies in the world. So this is a very different view of how we think about Atmanirbhar Bharat. Atmanirbhar Bharat is not about going back behind narrow domestic walls, as Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore had warned us. We don't want to go behind narrow domestic walls. This is merely creating spaces where we can build up strength so that we can compete in the rest of the world. And so we are actually, just as we are in certain areas creating providing some support to domestic capabilities, in other areas we are opening it up. So for example, in insurance, we think that, we need to open up. So we have lowered the threshold for domestic ownership. So now foreign ownership has gone up to 74%. Let the rest of the world come here and compete and create a sector that should be a bigger part of our lives here in India. So with that, let me stop. But I hope you've been able to understand how our intellectual framework is set up, the philosophical framework of our COVID response. It will also give you a sense of how we will respond to new things as they emerge as well into the future. And hopefully I've convinced you that we policymakers in India are not as crazy as maybe some of you had feared. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sanyal, really taking us through the decision making. Like right at the beginning, you mentioned decision making during a crisis is very, very different. It's a completely different ballgame. And I think the three key words that stuck to me from your talk are resilience, flexibility, and complexity. And I think coming from a biological systems, we also rely on this. Every biological system functions in a similar manner. So I think there are parallels between economics and biology, if I can say that. And
just so that you know this, much of traditional economics is based on Newtonian mathematics, whereas much of what we are doing is based on complex systems maths, which is indeed, if you are into ecological systems, you will know exactly the maths we are using. Much of what we do makes much more sense to biologists and physicists than it does to economists.
Yeah, because we live in uncertainty. And I think the pandemic has shown that there is really uncertainty. And it was really a nice study to see how the US responded and how India responded. And I think because there are local factors which determine, and even the pandemic all over the world, people have adopted different means. I think there is no right or wrong. What works for one country may not work for the other. I think I would like to request, I believe Dr. Sanyal has less time and he has other engagements. So I think if Dr. Kulkarni would like to have some comments or some questions to Dr. Sanyal, I would appreciate that. You have to unmute, Professor Kulkarni.
Okay.
Please, yeah.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was a very important as well as a very educational contrast between India's response and the US response. And I'm very happy that we could take this opportunity to bring out two approaches to fight the same pandemic this way as well as in that way. I think he acknowledged that strategies work differently for different countries, and one way or the other, we had to reach to the right answer is to overcome the economic effects of this pandemic.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Mande, are you there? Would you like to have any queries or any comments on Dr. Sanyal's talk and Dr. Kulkarni? Probably he's busy on another call. So Dr. Mule, would you, I think, okay, before that, I'll introduce briefly Dr. Mule before he gives a concluding remark.
Should I or should we wait for DG to say something?
I think perhaps he was in the call, perhaps he's busy with some other thing. So if he joins back, we will take him. But before that, I would like to introduce Dr. Mule. He's a social
I think
worker.
keep it just a sentence.
Yeah, sure.
I think let's.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's a social worker, renowned author, columnist, and former ambassador and secretary to the government of India. He's worked in many ministries and Ministry of Finance, Commerce, External Affairs, and advisor in the Cabinet Secretariat. So, with those very brief introduction, I request Dr. Daneshwar Muley to give the concluding remarks and put us in perspective of the speeches by the two eminent panelists.
Well, thank you, Geeta. I think overall, I have this benefit of not being an economist or not being a scientist or not being a technological person. I really strictly come from what we call humanitarian side or humanities, to be more precise. To begin with, it has been a very fascinating presentations from both sides. One, the oldest, quote unquote, oldest democracy, and on the other side we have the largest democracy dealing with the same virus, insignificant perhaps in its appearance, existence, but also very unpredictable in the way it has moved in a chaotic manner. What I see is the outcomes in many ways also all similar. The rich becoming richer, poor becoming poorer is a common thing that seems to have happened. Well, USA has a more, I would say, economically central approach. I think in India, even the economics is centered around people because of the large population that we have and the problems we need to address. So, rightly said by Sanjeev, it's not really stimulus based or capital based, but more kind of an investment. We are trying to invest in the economy, invest in the poorer sections of the society, and 800 million people getting food for several months in an uninterrupted manner in remote parts of India. In my view, is the biggest accomplishment of this kind in history, perhaps. There have been scarcities, there have been droughts, there have been natural calamities and man-made calamities. But this kind of a relief measure is an unprecedented scale because the calamity itself was unprecedented in so many ways. And the approach that we try to find out the solutions as we go along without really predetermining the outcome. Because frankly, this point was underlined many times by Sanjeev, that we are in a situation even today where we can't really see where this particular tunnel is going. And so we have to continue our efforts on the economic front. We have to continue our efforts on the scientific and technological front. We have to also try and improve our infrastructure and certainly leveraging the skills that we have. And in that context, India's own offer to the world, 150 countries were supplied with medicines. 70 countries have been supplied with more than 5.8 crore or 50 million vaccines. India generally being considered developing country, this achievement really perhaps has even in a sense outdid even the most developed countries. The other thing I realize is sometimes do things like the First Amendment in USA, does it come in tackling and keeping the numbers lower? For example, everybody saying that we have right not to wear masks because of the constitutional right. And USA does not seem to have come out of the big numbers, of daily additions. So how long can you be giving and increasing countries' deficit to an unprecedented level? And as you rightly said, that the bond market eventually will lose interest in buying. It may not happen in the near future, but if the situation lasts longer, all of us have faced economic difficulties. Many sectors have suffered. People have suffered unemployment in India. People have lost jobs in so many sectors. But it's good to see the differences in approach. and how governments work. But of course, if I understand correctly, Dr. Kulkarni's approach was more based on macro economic trends than micro ones. While I think Sanjeev was really able to give us both some of the micro aspects while dealing with the macro situation that government has to tackle, because common public is not really bothered much about macro situation. They are really suffering on account of the direct impact that the COVID-19 has had on their life. I'm not going on other things, but I do find it interesting that the government of India has used this opportunity to introduce new reforms, which is also an interesting thing, rather than looking at it from adding taxes, which seems to be the US approach. And the first thing that perhaps President Biden will be doing is introducing some new taxes. I believe that's what I heard day before. So all in all, we are going to face a difficult, complex, and kind of unpredictable situation in the coming months. And who knows whether it will last for a year or two. Many solutions are being forwarded. They are being scrutinized, tested, both on people and in the laboratories. And let's hope, as Dr. Kulkarni, left on the optimistic note, saying that, well, vaccines are there, will a brighter economic prospect lie to behind. My understanding is maybe is the same, but let's work in that direction. I thank Dr. Mande for giving me this opportunity to chair Prabhas. Thank Dr. Kulkarni for having started this interesting dialogue. This is the second one where you have participated under the Prabhas umbrella or the Vaibhav umbrella. And thank you, Sanjeev. It's been a pleasure listening to you. It's been really wonderful rendition. People like me need to understand more of the economics, because every day, being a member of the NHRC, I keep on issuing notices to the various organs of the government, explain this, explain that. So, but to have this economic, picture at the back of my mind will certainly help me personally. Thank you once again, Rama and Geeta, for providing the infrastructural facilities for organizing this very stimulating webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mole. Now I request Dr. Rama Bansal to propose the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Geeta. It's my privilege to offer vote of thanks. On behalf of CSR and the Prabhas initiative, I express sincere gratitude to all for sparing their valuable time and views on this very, very relevant topic, the economic effects of coronavirus. We heard very insightful talks and views and visions from our eminent speakers today. We are very thankful to you, Professor Kulkarni, Distinguished Professor of Economics, University of Denver, USA, for your suggestion to connect the diaspora through lectures and talks and proposing the topic for today's webinar. Thank you so much for presenting the US perspective in this domain. Very useful indeed. I would like to use this opportunity also to request you for your continued support to Prabhas initiative and connect more diaspora with India through this portal. We express our sincere gratitude to Sri Sanjeev Sanyal, our Principal Economic Advisor to Government of India, who very readily accepted our request very promptly, and he supported us for organizing this webinar. Thank you, sir, for enriching us with your thoughts and insights. We look forward to your continued support to CSIR. I'm also delighted to express our gratitude to Dr. Dhyaneshwar Mule, Member, National Human Rights Commission of India and Chairman Prabhas, for his continued guidance and support and untiring efforts towards connecting the Indian diaspora with India. Thank you so much, sir, for your guidance and support, continued support rather, towards this webinar. Our very own CSIR DG and Secretary DSIR, Dr. Shekhar C. Mande, who has always been very, very kind and supportive to our activities, bestowing his trust in us and guiding us throughout. Sir, your support and guidance helped us plan and organize this webinar and many more upcoming ones. We are sincerely grateful and thankful to you, sir. I would also like to thank all my colleagues from CSIR, especially Dr. Geeta, you, Dr. Mahesh, Dr. Mohit, other members from CSIR, especially from the IT and Prabhas team who worked and helped to make this webinar possible. Last but not the least, our big thank you to all our viewers, audience, students, researchers, and my colleagues who have joined us online through various media. Thank you for your active participation. We hope you have been benefited by the thoughts and discussions today. Thank you once again, and all the very best for your good health. Stay safe. Good night to our colleagues from West, and a very good day ahead to our friends from the East. Bye-bye. Namaskar.
Thank you. Thank you.